The morning of June 15th, 2013, started like any other Saturday in the Miller household, but by sunset it would become the day that shattered everything they thought they knew about their family. David Miller was 23 years old, fresh out of Georgetown University with a degree in environmental science, and possessed the kind of restless energy that comes from being young, privileged, and desperate to prove you're more than just your father's name. Senator Marcus Miller had built his political career on family values and environmental protection, ironically enough, and David seemed determined to live up to that legacy in his own way. What nobody knew that morning was that David had been planning something for weeks, something he hadn't shared with anyone, not even his girlfriend Sarah, who later told investigators she thought he was acting strange in the days leading up to his disappearance. The Everglades had always fascinated David. Growing up in Washington, D.C., he'd spend hours reading about the mysterious wetlands, the way they'd swallow people whole and keep their secrets for decades. His mother, Eleanor, a former investigative journalist who'd traded her press badge for environmental activism after marrying into politics, had always encouraged his curiosity about the natural world. She taught him to ask questions, to dig deeper, to never accept the first answer you're given. She had no idea that these very lessons would one day drive her to uncover truths that would tear their world apart. David had visited the Everglades twice before, both times with guided tours that stayed on the marked trails, and took visitors to the safe, sanitized viewing areas. This time was different. This time, he wanted to go alone. The park rangers at the Everglades National Park later told investigators that David seemed prepared and confident when he picked up his wilderness permit that Friday afternoon. He'd listed his intended route as a 3-day canoe expedition through some of the more remote waterways, areas where cell phone service was non-existent and where even experienced guides rarely ventured. The young ranger who processed his paperwork, a college intern named Jake Martinez, remembered thinking it was unusual for someone to tackle those channels solo, especially someone who looked like he'd be more comfortable in a boardroom than a swamp. But David had all the right equipment, knew the regulations and had signed all the waivers. Martinez stamped the permit and wished him luck, never imagining he'd be testifying about this interaction in congressional hearings years later. Eleanor Miller was in her garden that Saturday morning, tending to the roses that had become her obsession since retiring from journalism. The morning sun felt warm on her shoulders, and she remembered feeling grateful for the peaceful weekend ahead. Marcus was at the Capitol, dealing with some last-minute votes on environmental legislation, and David was supposed to be sleeping in before meeting friends for brunch. The house felt unusually quiet, but that wasn't alarming. David had always been independent, even as a child, the kind of boy who'd disappear for hours exploring the woods behind their house and emerge dirty and grinning with stories of imaginary adventures. She had no way of knowing that he'd left before dawn, his canoe already strapped to his jeep, driving toward what would become the most investigated square mile of swampland in American history. The first sign something was wrong came Sunday evening, when Sarah called the house, her voice tight with worry. David hadn't shown up for their dinner date, and he wasn't answering his phone. Eleanor felt that familiar maternal flutter of concern, but she told herself it wasn't unusual. David was notorious for losing track of time when he was focused on something. But when Monday morning arrived and he still hadn't returned, that flutter became a knot of dread that would never fully leave her stomach. Marcus tried to stay calm, suggesting they wait another day before involving the authorities. Politicians don't like unnecessary attention, and missing person reports tend to attract the wrong kind of headlines. But Eleanor's journalistic instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong. By Tuesday, they couldn't wait any longer. The missing person report was filed at precisely 9:47 a.m., and within hours, the story had leaked to the press. Senator's son missing in Everglades ran on every major network by the evening news. The National Park Service immediately launched a search and rescue operation, deploying helicopters, airboats, and dozens of rangers into the vast wilderness where David was supposed to be camping. The search area covered over 200 square miles of some of the most treacherous terrain in the country, a maze of waterways where the wrong turn could lead to quicksand, alligator-infested pools, or simply endless stretches of sawgrass that all looked exactly the same. The media attention was immediate and overwhelming. News vans lined the street outside the Miller house, reporters shouting questions every time Eleanor or Marcus stepped outside. The family tried to maintain their composure, holding press conferences and pleading for information, but beneath the surface, cracks were already beginning to show. Marcus was furious about the publicity, worried about how this would affect his re-election campaign. Eleanor was consumed with guilt, wondering if she should have insisted David take someone with him, wondering if the adventurous spirit she'd nurtured in him had somehow led to his destruction. The stress was tearing them apart at exactly the moment they needed each other most. On the fourth day of searching, the rescue teams found David's canoe. It was wedged against a fallen cypress tree in a remote channel nearly 30 miles from his intended route, the aluminum hull dented and scratched but otherwise intact. His backpack was still secured to the stern, containing his camping gear, extra clothes and enough food for a week. His camera was there too, an expensive digital SLR that he'd been excited to use for wildlife photography, but David himself was nowhere to be found. The discovery only deepened the mystery and intensified the search efforts, because experienced paddlers don't simply vanish from their boats in calm water. The search expanded to include dive teams from 3 different counties, K9 units, and thermal imaging equipment. They found pieces of David's life scattered throughout the swamp, like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale gone wrong. A water bottle here, a torn piece of his shirt there, his baseball cap caught on a branch 15 feet off the ground. Each discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had his belongings been distributed across such a wide area? Why was there no sign of struggle or distress? The search dogs kept losing his scent at the water's edge, as if he'd simply evaporated into the humid air. Eleanor threw herself into the search with the same intensity she'd once brought to her investigative reporting. She learned to read topographical maps, studied tidal patterns, and interviewed every person who'd been in the area that weekend. She couldn't understand why the official search seemed so disorganized, why certain areas were being avoided, why some of the park rangers seemed evasive when she asked specific questions about David's planned route. Her reporter's instincts told her there was more to the story, but she couldn't quite grasp what she was missing. She had no idea that her questions were already making certain people very nervous. 3 weeks into the search, the official operation was scaled back. The Park Service issued a statement citing the vast search area and the challenges posed by the unique ecosystem of the Everglades. They promised to continue investigating any new leads, but the daily helicopter flights stopped, the dive teams were reassigned, and the media moved on to fresher tragedies. Eleanor felt abandoned by everyone except her own determination to find answers. Marcus wanted to accept that their son was gone and begin the process of grieving, but Eleanor couldn't let go. She'd spent her career uncovering secrets that powerful people wanted to keep buried, and she could smell a cover-up even through her maternal grief. The official conclusion was that David Miller had suffered a tragic accident while canoeing alone in dangerous waters. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as drowning, even though no body had been recovered. The case was quietly closed, filed away in the vast bureaucracy of the National Park Service, and the Miller family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Marcus threw himself into his senatorial duties with renewed vigor, perhaps hoping that serving his constituents could somehow balance the scales for failing to protect his own son. Eleanor retreated from public life, but she never stopped looking for answers. Years passed. The acute pain of loss settled into a chronic ache that colored everything Eleanor did. She sold the house in Georgetown and moved to a smaller place in Virginia, somewhere without so many memories. She threw herself into environmental activism, working with organizations that monitored satellite imagery for illegal activities in protected areas. It was meaningful work, and it helped her feel connected to David's passion for the natural world. She learned to read satellite images the way she'd once read court documents, looking for patterns and anomalies that others might miss. She had no idea that this new skill would eventually lead her back to the Everglades, back to her son, and back to a truth that someone had worked very hard to keep hidden. But on a Tuesday morning in late 2025, 12 years after David's disappearance, Eleanor was reviewing routine satellite imagery of the Everglades when she saw something that made her blood run cold. Deep in the heart of the swamp, in an area that should have been completely undisturbed, there was a perfect geometric shape that had no business being there. It was small, barely visible at the resolution she was working with, but it was definitely artificial. And according to the metadata, it had been there for over a decade. Eleanor stared at the screen for a long time, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror, because she knew with absolute certainty that she was looking at the first real clue to what had happened to her son. Eleanor's hands trembled as she enhanced the image, zooming in until the pixels began to blur and break apart. The shape was roughly rectangular, maybe 30 feet by 15 feet, sitting on what appeared to be a small island of solid ground in the middle of an otherwise impassable stretch of swampland. From this height and resolution, it was impossible to tell what it was, but its edges were too clean, too straight to be anything natural. The Everglades didn't create perfect rectangles. Nature didn't work in right angles. Someone had built something out there, something that had been hidden from the world for over a decade, and Eleanor was the first person to notice it. The location coordinates made her stomach clench with recognition. She pulled up her old files, the ones she'd never been able to throw away, and cross-referenced the satellite image with the search maps from 2013. The shape was located approximately 4 miles southeast of where David's canoe had been found, in an area that the official search teams had marked as inaccessible on their reports. But looking at the satellite imagery, Eleanor could see what appeared to be a narrow channel of water leading directly to the spot. It would have been difficult to navigate, requiring intimate knowledge of the waterways and perfect timing with the tides, but it wasn't impossible. Certainly not impossible for someone with David's determination and skill. Eleanor had learned over the years to trust her instincts, and right now, every instinct was screaming that this discovery was connected to her son's disappearance. But she also knew that after 12 years of false hopes and dead ends, she couldn't afford to let her emotions cloud her judgment. She needed better images, higher resolution data, and she needed to find out if anyone else had noticed this anomaly. The environmental monitoring organization she worked with had access to commercial satellite databases, but the really detailed imagery, the kind that could reveal what this structure actually was, required special permissions and significant money. She started making phone calls. Her first contact was Dr. James Chen, a remote sensing specialist at the University of Miami who'd helped her with previous projects. Chen was intrigued by her description of the anomaly and agreed to run the coordinates through his more advanced imaging systems. While she waited for his callback, Eleanor began researching the history of that particular section of the Everglades. What she found made her even more suspicious about the official investigation into David's disappearance. The area where she'd spotted the rectangular shape had been the subject of a land use dispute for decades. In the 1990s, a development company had purchased mineral rights to several parcels of land deep in the Everglades, claiming they intended to conduct geological surveys for potential phosphate mining. Environmental groups had fought the permits in court for years, but the company had maintained legal access to the area until 2015, 2 years after David's disappearance. The coincidence made Eleanor's skin crawl. Someone had legal justification to be operating in that remote area during the exact time frame when her son had gone missing. Dr. Chen called back 3 hours later, and the excitement in his voice was unmistakable. He'd managed to obtain higher resolution imagery from a different satellite provider, and what he'd found was extraordinary. The rectangular shape was definitely artificial, and it appeared to be some kind of prefabricated structure, possibly a mobile building or large trailer, but even more interesting were the marks around it, faint lines in the earth that suggested vehicular traffic, equipment placement, and what looked like a temporary access road leading to a natural landing area by the water. Eleanor asked Chen to send her everything he had, and when the images arrived in her email, she spent hours studying every pixel. The structure looked like it could be a field office or research station, the kind of temporary building that companies use for remote operations. There were clear signs that heavy equipment had been moved in and out of the area, and the access road showed evidence of regular use over an extended period. Most disturbing of all, the imagery Chen had obtained was date-stamped from July 2013, just 1 month after David's disappearance. Whatever this operation was, it had been active during the exact time frame when her son had vanished. Eleanor printed out the satellite images and spread them across her dining room table like pieces of a puzzle. She traced the water routes with her finger, following the channels from the main waterways to the hidden structure. It would have taken skill and local knowledge to navigate these passages, but it was definitely possible for someone in a canoe. David had been an experienced paddler, and he'd always been drawn to the kind of challenges that would keep other people away. If he'd somehow discovered this operation, if he'd stumbled across something he wasn't supposed to see, It would explain why his canoe had been found so far from his intended route. The more Eleanor studied the images, the more convinced she became that David had indeed reached this location. The timeline fit perfectly. He disappeared on a Saturday, and based on his planned route, he could have reached this area by Sunday morning. If he'd encountered whatever operation was running out of that structure, if he'd tried to investigate or take photographs, it would explain everything that had puzzled investigators about his disappearance. It would explain why his belongings had been scattered across such a wide area, why the search dogs had lost his scent, why certain areas had been declared inaccessible during the official search. Eleanor knew she needed to find out more about the company that had held mineral rights to this area. She spent the rest of the evening digging through corporate records, environmental impact statements, and legal filings related to the land use dispute. What she discovered was a web of shell companies and holding corporations that seemed designed to obscure the true ownership of the mineral rights. At the center of it all was a company called Everglades Resource Development, which had been incorporated in Delaware just 6 months before David's disappearance and dissolved just 6 months after the official search had been called off. The incorporation papers for Everglades Resource Development listed only a registered agent and a post office box in Miami. The company had no website, no public statements, and no apparent business activities beyond holding the mineral rights to several thousand acres of remote swampland. Eleanor's investigative instincts told her this was exactly the kind of shell company that people use when they want to conduct business without leaving a paper trail. But someone had to be behind it, someone with enough money and influence to navigate the complex legal requirements for operating in a national park. Eleanor decided to drive down to Miami to investigate in person. She told herself she was just following up on a lead, that she was being thorough and professional, but deep down she knew this was about more than closure. This was about justice for David, and about exposing whatever truth had been buried in that swamp for 12 years. She had no idea that her investigation had already triggered alarms in places she couldn't imagine, or that powerful people were already working to make sure she never found what she was looking for. The drive to Miami took her through the same small towns that had been staging areas for the search and rescue operation in 2013. Eleanor found herself stopping at the same gas stations and convenience stores where she'd spent countless hours posting flyers with David's photograph. Most of the people she'd met during those desperate weeks had moved on with their lives, but a few remembered her, and their sympathetic expressions reminded her of just how much hope she'd lost over the years. She wondered what they would think if they knew she might finally be close to finding answers. At the Miami courthouse, Eleanor spent hours combing through public records related to Everglades Resource Development. The paper trail was frustratingly thin, clearly designed by lawyers who knew how to minimize disclosure requirements. But Eleanor had learned patience during her journalism career, and she knew that even the most carefully constructed cover-ups usually contained a flaw, some small detail that had been overlooked. In this case, the flaw was a single environmental impact assessment that had been filed as part of the company's permit application. The environmental assessment was supposedly conducted by an independent consulting firm, but Eleanor recognized the writing style and technical language. She'd seen similar reports during her environmental activism work, and she was certain this assessment had been prepared by Teradyne Environmental Services, a company that specialized in providing regulatory cover for controversial projects. Teradyne had a reputation for producing studies that found no significant environmental impact, regardless of what their clients were actually planning to do. If Teradyne had been involved in preparing permits for Everglades resource development, it meant someone had been planning a substantial operation in that remote area. Eleanor managed to get a phone number for Teradyne's Miami office, but when she called pretending to be a potential client, she was told that all records related to Everglades projects had been sealed under a confidentiality agreement. The receptionist was polite but firm. Teradyne could not discuss any work they might have done in the Everglades area between 2012 and 2015. The woman's careful phrasing told Eleanor everything she needed to know. There had definitely been a project. It had definitely involved the area where David disappeared, and someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure no one could find out what it was. That evening, Eleanor sat in her hotel room overlooking Biscayne Bay, trying to piece together what she'd learned. David had disappeared while canoeing in an area where a mysterious company had legal permission to conduct some kind of operation. The company had been incorporated just before his disappearance and dissolved shortly after the search was called off. A consulting firm with a questionable reputation had prepared environmental assessments for the project, and all records related to it had been sealed. The satellite imagery showed clear evidence of a substantial operation that had been active during the exact time frame of David's disappearance. Eleanor knew she was onto something significant, but she also knew she was approaching the limits of what she could discover through public records and satellite imagery. If she wanted to know what had really happened to David, she would need to find someone who had been directly involved in whatever operation had been running out of that structure in the swamp. She would need to find someone willing to break their silence after 12 years of keeping secrets. And she had a feeling that someone had been waiting for exactly this moment, when the truth could finally be told. Eleanor's hands trembled as she enhanced the image, zooming in until the pixels began to blur and break apart. The shape was roughly rectangular, maybe 30 feet by 15 feet, sitting on what appeared to be a small island of solid ground in the middle of an otherwise impassable stretch of swampland. From this height and resolution, it was impossible to tell what it was, but its edges were too clean, too straight to be anything natural. The Everglades didn't create perfect rectangles. Nature didn't work in right angles. Someone had built something out there, something that had been hidden from the world for over a decade, and Eleanor was the first person to notice it. The location coordinates made her stomach clench with recognition. She pulled up her old files, the ones she'd never been able to throw away, and cross-referenced the satellite image with the search maps from 2013. The shape was located approximately 4 miles southeast of where David's canoe had been found, in an area that the official search teams had marked as inaccessible on their reports. But looking at the satellite imagery, Eleanor could see what appeared to be a narrow channel of water leading directly to the spot. It would have been difficult to navigate, requiring intimate knowledge of the waterways and perfect timing with the tides, but it wasn't impossible. Certainly not impossible for someone with David's determination and skill. Eleanor had learned over the years to trust her instincts, and right now every instinct was screaming that this discovery was connected to her son's disappearance. But she also knew that after 12 years of false hopes and dead ends, she couldn't afford to let her emotions cloud her judgment. She needed better images, higher resolution data, and she needed to find out if anyone else had noticed this anomaly. The environmental monitoring organization she worked with had access to commercial satellite databases, but the really detailed imagery, the kind that could reveal what this structure actually was, required special permissions and significant money. She started making phone calls. Her first contact was Dr. James Chen, a remote sensing specialist at the University of Miami who'd helped her with previous projects. Chen was intrigued by her description of the anomaly and agreed to run the coordinates through his more advanced imaging systems. While she waited for his callback, Eleanor began researching the history of that particular section of the Everglades. What she found made her even more suspicious about the official investigation into David's disappearance. The area where she'd spotted the rectangular shape had been the subject of a land use dispute for decades. In the 1990s, a development company had purchased mineral rights to several parcels of land deep in the Everglades, claiming they intended to conduct geological surveys for potential phosphate mining. Environmental groups had fought the permits in court for years, but the company had maintained legal access to the area until 2015, 2 years after David's disappearance. The coincidence made Eleanor's skin crawl. Someone had legal justification to be operating in that remote area during the exact time frame when her son had gone missing. Dr. Chen called back 3 hours later, and the excitement in his voice was unmistakable. He'd managed to obtain higher resolution imagery from a different satellite provider, and what he'd found was extraordinary. The rectangular shape was definitely artificial, and it appeared to be some kind of prefabricated structure, possibly a mobile building or large trailer, but even more interesting were the marks around it, faint lines in the earth that suggested vehicular traffic, equipment placement, and what looked like a temporary access road leading to a natural landing area by the water. Eleanor asked Chen to send her everything he had, and when the images arrived in her email, she spent hours studying every pixel. The structure looked like it could be a field office or research station, the kind of temporary building that companies use for remote operations. There were clear signs that heavy equipment had been moved in and out of the area, and the access road showed evidence of regular use over an extended period. Most disturbing of all, the imagery Chen had obtained was date-stamped from July 2013, just 1 month after David's disappearance. Whatever this operation was, it had been active during the exact time frame when her son had vanished. Eleanor printed out the satellite images and spread them across her dining room table like pieces of a puzzle. She traced the water routes with her finger, following the channels from the main waterways to the hidden structure. It would have taken skill and local knowledge to navigate these passages, but it was definitely possible for someone in a canoe. David had been an experienced paddler, and he'd always been drawn to the kind of challenges that would keep other people away. If he'd somehow discovered this operation, if he'd stumbled across something he wasn't supposed to see, it would explain why his canoe had been found so far from his intended route. The more Eleanor studied the images, the more convinced she became that David had indeed reached this location. The timeline fit perfectly. He disappeared on a Saturday, and based on his planned route, he could have reached this area by Sunday morning. If he'd encountered whatever operation was running out of that structure, if he'd tried to investigate or take photographs, it would explain everything that had puzzled investigators about his disappearance. It would explain why his belongings had been scattered across such a wide area, why the search dogs had lost his scent, why certain areas had been declared inaccessible during the official search. Eleanor knew she needed to find out more about the company that had held mineral rights to this area. She spent the rest of the evening digging through corporate records, environmental impact statements, and legal filings related to the land use dispute. What she discovered was a web of shell companies and holding corporations that seemed designed to obscure the true ownership of the mineral rights. At the center of it all was a company called Everglades Resource Development, which had been incorporated in Delaware just 6 months before David's disappearance and dissolved just 6 months after the official search had been called off. The incorporation papers for Everglades Resource Development listed only a registered agent and a post office box in Miami. The company had no website, no public statements, and no apparent business activities beyond holding the mineral rights to several thousand acres of remote swampland. Eleanor's investigative instincts told her this was exactly the kind of shell company that people use when they want to conduct business without leaving a paper trail. But someone had to be behind it, someone with enough money and influence to navigate the complex legal requirements for operating in a national park. Eleanor decided to drive down to Miami to investigate in person. She told herself she was just following up on a lead, that she was being thorough and professional, but deep down she knew this was about more than closure. This was about justice for David, and about exposing whatever truth had been buried in that swamp for 12 years. She had no idea that her investigation had already triggered alarms in places she couldn't imagine, or that powerful people were already working to make sure she never found what she was looking for. The drive to Miami took her through the same small towns that had been staging areas for the search and rescue operation in 2013. Eleanor found herself stopping at the same gas stations and convenience stores where she'd spent countless hours posting flyers with David's photograph. Most of the people she'd met during those desperate weeks had moved on with their lives, but a few remembered her, and their sympathetic expressions reminded her of just how much hope she'd lost over the years. She wondered what they would think if they knew she might finally be close to finding answers. At the Miami courthouse, Eleanor spent hours combing through public records related to Everglades Resource Development. The paper trail was frustratingly thin, clearly designed by lawyers who knew how to minimize disclosure requirements. But Eleanor had learned patience during her journalism career, and she knew that even the most carefully constructed cover-ups usually contained a flaw, some small detail that had been overlooked. In this case, the flaw was a single environmental impact assessment that had been filed as part of the company's permit application. The environmental assessment was supposedly conducted by an independent consulting firm, but Eleanor recognized the writing style and technical language. She'd seen similar reports during her environmental activism work, and she was certain this assessment had been prepared by Teradyne Environmental Services, a company that specialized in providing regulatory cover for controversial projects. Teradyne had a reputation for producing studies that found no significant environmental impact, regardless of what their clients were actually planning to do. If Teradyne had been involved in preparing permits for Everglades resource development, it meant someone had been planning a substantial operation in that remote area. Eleanor managed to get a phone number for Teradyne's Miami office, But when she called pretending to be a potential client, she was told that all records related to Everglades projects had been sealed under a confidentiality agreement. The receptionist was polite but firm. Teradyne could not discuss any work they might have done in the Everglades area between 2012 and 2015. The woman's careful phrasing told Eleanor everything she needed to know. There had definitely been a project. It had definitely involved the area where David disappeared, and someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure no one could find out what it was. That evening, Eleanor sat in her hotel room overlooking Biscayne Bay, trying to piece together what she'd learned. David had disappeared while canoeing in an area where a mysterious company had legal permission to conduct some kind of operation. The company had been incorporated just before his disappearance and dissolved shortly after the search was called off. A consulting firm with a questionable reputation had prepared environmental assessments for the project, and all records related to it had been sealed. The satellite imagery showed clear evidence of a substantial operation that had been active during the exact time frame of David's disappearance. Eleanor knew she was onto something significant, but she also knew she was approaching the limits of what she could discover through public records and satellite imagery. If she wanted to know what had really happened to David, she would need to find someone who had been directly involved in whatever operation had been running out of that structure in the swamp. She would need to find someone willing to break their silence after 12 years of keeping secrets. And she had a feeling that someone had been waiting for exactly this moment, when the truth could finally be told. The next morning, Eleanor drove to the address listed for Teradyne's Miami office, hoping to find more information despite the previous day's phone rejection. The building was a sleek glass tower in the financial district, the kind of place where environmental consulting firms rent small offices to maintain a professional appearance for clients who prefer not to ask too many questions. But when Eleanor reached the 23rd floor and found Suite 2347, she discovered that Teradyne Environmental Services had moved out over a year ago, leaving no forwarding address. The current tenant was a tax preparation service, and the receptionist there told Eleanor that Teradyne had left suddenly in the middle of their lease, taking everything, including the furniture. The cleaning crew had found the office completely empty, except for a few scattered papers in the trash. Eleanor's heart raced. Companies don't abandon their offices unless they're either going bankrupt or trying to disappear quickly. Teradyne's sudden departure suggested that someone had decided it was time to eliminate any connections to whatever had happened in the Everglades. Eleanor spent the next 2 days trying to track down former Teradyne employees through LinkedIn and professional networking sites. Most of the company's staff had scattered to other environmental consulting firms throughout Florida, but she finally managed to locate Maria Santos, a junior environmental scientist who had worked for Teradyne from 2011 to 2014. Santos agreed to meet Eleanor for coffee, though she seemed nervous about the request, and insisted on meeting at a busy chain restaurant rather than somewhere they could speak privately. Maria Santos was a petite woman in her early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes that kept scanning the restaurant as if she expected to see someone she recognized. She listened carefully as Eleanor explained her search for information about Everglades resource development, but her expression grew increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation progressed. Finally, Santos interrupted Eleanor mid-sentence and asked if she could speak frankly. Eleanor nodded, sensing that she was about to hear something important. Santos explained that she had indeed worked on the environmental assessment for Everglades resource development, and that the project had been unlike anything else Teradyne had ever handled. The client had paid an enormous fee for what should have been routine paperwork, and they had insisted on unusual confidentiality requirements that went far beyond standard industry practice. Santos had been required to sign a non-disclosure agreement that was so restrictive, it even prohibited her from mentioning the client's name to her own supervisors at Teradyne. What had made Santos particularly uncomfortable was the nature of the environmental assessment itself. She had been instructed to prepare a study that would justify minimal environmental oversight for a geological survey operation, but the equipment list and operational parameters she'd been given didn't match what you would expect for mineral exploration. The client had requested permits for heavy machinery, temporary structures, and waste disposal procedures that seemed more appropriate for an industrial operation than a scientific survey. Santos had raised her concerns with her supervisor at Teradyne, but she'd been told to process the application exactly as specified by the client. The message was clear. Teradyne was being paid to provide regulatory cover, not to ask questions about what the client was actually planning to do. Santos had completed the assessment as instructed, but she'd kept copies of all the documentation because something about the entire project had made her deeply uneasy. Eleanor's pulse quickened as Santos described the equipment that Everglades Resource Development had requested permits for. The list included portable buildings, generators, industrial pumping equipment, and something called specialized extraction machinery that wasn't further defined in the paperwork. It sounded less like a geological survey and more like a mining operation, which would have been completely illegal in a national park. But if someone had been conducting illegal mining activities in the Everglades, it would explain the structure Eleanor had seen in the satellite imagery, and it might explain what had happened to David. Santos agreed to provide Eleanor with copies of the documents she'd kept, but only on the condition that Eleanor never reveal where she'd obtained them. The non-disclosure agreement Santos had signed was still legally binding, and she couldn't afford to be sued by whoever was behind Everglades Resource Development. Eleanor agreed to the terms, understanding that Santos was taking a significant risk by sharing this information. They arranged to meet the following day at a public library, where Santos could discreetly transfer the documents. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her hotel room, her mind racing with possibilities. If David had somehow discovered an illegal mining operation in the Everglades, if he'd taken photographs or tried to report what he'd seen, it would provide a clear motive for someone to make sure he never made it home. The timing was perfect, the location matched exactly, and the secretive nature of the operation explained why the official search had been so mysteriously limited in certain areas. But Eleanor also knew she was dealing with people who had managed to keep this secret for 12 years, people with enough money and influence to shut down environmental consulting firms and make documents disappear. If she was right about what had happened to David, then she was investigating something that powerful people had already killed to protect. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a cold determination. She'd spent 12 years wondering what had happened to her son, and now she finally had a chance to find out. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the library 30 minutes early and chose a table near the back where she could watch the entrance. Santos appeared exactly on time, carrying a thin manila envelope that she slid across the table without ceremony. The documents inside were photocopies of the original permit applications, environmental assessments, and equipment lists that Santos had helped prepare for Everglades Resource Development. As Eleanor scanned through the papers, she felt her breath catch in her throat. The operational timeline for the Everglades project showed that heavy equipment had been scheduled for transport to the site on June 14, 2013, just one day before David's disappearance. The project was supposed to continue for approximately 6 weeks, ending in late July, which matched perfectly with the satellite imagery that showed activity at the site during that time period. But most shocking of all was a handwritten note on one of the equipment lists that mentioned security protocols for unexpected visitors and contingency procedures for operational exposure. Eleanor stared at that note for a long time, her journalist's mind immediately grasping the implications. Someone had been worried about unexpected visitors to their illegal operation, worried enough to develop contingency procedures for dealing with them. If David had stumbled across this mining operation during his canoe trip, if he'd been categorized as an unexpected visitor, it would explain everything that had happened afterward. It would explain why his canoe had been found empty, why his belongings had been scattered across such a wide area, and why the official search had avoided certain parts of the swamp. Eleanor thanked Santos for her courage in sharing the documents and promised again to protect her identity. As Santos hurried away, clearly nervous about what she'd just done, Eleanor remained at the library table, reading through the papers again and again. She now had documentary evidence that an illegal operation had been taking place in the exact area where David had disappeared, during the exact time frame of his canoe trip. She had proof that the people running this operation had been concerned about unexpected visitors and had developed procedures for dealing with them. But Eleanor also knew that having evidence and being able to prove what had happened were two very different things. The documents Santos had provided proved that something suspicious had been planned, but they didn't prove that David had discovered it or that anyone had harmed him. Eleanor would need more than paperwork to convince authorities to reopen the investigation into her son's disappearance. She would need physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, or proof that crimes had actually been committed. As Eleanor sat in the library, surrounded by the quiet hum of people going about their normal lives, she realized that her investigation had reached a critical turning point. She could take what she'd learned to the authorities and hope they would be willing to reopen a 12-year-old case based on circumstantial evidence and suspicious documents. Or she could continue investigating on her own, following the trail wherever it led, regardless of the risks involved. Eleanor thought about David, about his passion for environmental protection and his determination to expose the truth about threats to the natural world. She thought about the past 12 years of wondering and waiting, of living with questions that had no answers. And she thought about the note she'd just read, about contingency procedures for unexpected visitors, about what might have happened to her son when he became one of those visitors. Eleanor Miller had spent 12 years being a grieving mother, accepting the official explanations and trying to find peace with an incomplete truth. But as she gathered up the documents and prepared to leave the library, she felt something she hadn't experienced in over a decade. She felt like an investigative journalist again, following a story that someone desperately wanted to keep buried. And she knew that no matter what it cost her, no matter what risks she had to take, she was going to find out exactly what had happened to David in that swamp. Eleanor's first stop after leaving the library was the Miami headquarters of the National Park Service, a modest building that housed the administrative offices for Everglades National Park. She'd been there many times during the original search for David, pleading with officials to expand the search area or reconsider their conclusions about his disappearance. Back then, she'd been treated with the kind of polite sympathy reserved for grieving family members who couldn't accept reality. This time she had documents that proved reality was more complicated than anyone had admitted. The current superintendent of Everglades National Park was Dr. Patricia Valdez, a career Park Service employee who had taken over the position in 2018, 5 years after David's disappearance. Valdez had not been involved in the original investigation, which Eleanor hoped might make her more willing to consider new evidence. Eleanor requested a meeting, explaining that she had uncovered information relevant to her son's case that needed to be reviewed by park officials. Dr. Valdez agreed to see Eleanor the following day, and when Eleanor arrived at the appointed time, she found the superintendent to be a serious woman in her 50s with the kind of direct manner that suggested she didn't have patience for conspiracy theories or false hope. Eleanor spread the Teradyne documents across Valdez's desk and explained how she'd discovered the satellite imagery anomaly that had led to this information. Valdez listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but her expression remained professionally neutral. When Eleanor finished her presentation, Dr. Valdez studied the documents for several minutes before speaking. She acknowledged that the timeline was concerning, and that the presence of an unauthorized operation in the park during David's disappearance raised serious questions. But she also pointed out that the documents didn't prove any connection between the operation and David's fate, and that reopening a federal investigation would require more substantial evidence than what Eleanor had provided. Eleanor had expected this response, but she pressed Dr. Valdez about why the original search teams had marked the area around the satellite anomaly as inaccessible. Valdez pulled up the digital files from the 2013 search and rescue operation, and as she scrolled through the reports, her expression grew increasingly troubled. The area in question had been classified as inaccessible due to dangerous wildlife concentrations and unstable terrain, but there was no supporting documentation for these claims. More concerning was a notation in the search coordinator's daily log that Eleanor had never seen before. On the third day of the search, someone had contacted park headquarters to report that the area southeast of where David's canoe was found was being used for authorized scientific research and should be avoided by search teams to prevent contamination of ongoing studies. The notation included a reference number for the supposed research permit, but when Dr. Valdez looked up that number in the park's database, no such permit existed. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as the implications became clear. Someone had actively interfered with the search for her son, using false claims about authorized research to keep rescue teams away from the area where the illegal mining operation was taking place. This wasn't just a case of an unfortunate accident. This was evidence of a deliberate cover-up that had prevented David from being found during the critical first days after his disappearance. Dr. Valdez was clearly shaken by this discovery. She'd spent her entire career with the National Park Service and took seriously the agency's responsibility to protect both the environment and the people who visited it. The idea that someone had manipulated a search and rescue operation to protect an illegal activity in the park was deeply disturbing to her. She agreed to launch an internal investigation into how the false research permit claim had been processed and who had been responsible for excluding that area from the search. Eleanor left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic for the first time in years. She finally had an official ally in her quest for answers, someone with the authority to access records and resources that had been beyond her reach. But she also knew that internal investigations moved slowly, and she wasn't willing to wait months or years for bureaucratic processes to provide answers. She had momentum now, and she intended to use it. Eleanor's next step was to find out more about the equipment that had been transported to the illegal operations site. The Teradyne documents included detailed specifications for industrial pumping equipment and extraction machinery, but they didn't identify the companies that had supplied or transported this equipment. Eleanor reasoned that moving heavy machinery into the remote areas of the Everglades would have required specialized transport services, and there couldn't be many companies in South Florida capable of handling such a challenging logistical operation. After several hours of online research, Eleanor identified 3 companies in the Miami area that specialized in transporting heavy equipment to remote locations for construction and mining projects. She decided to visit each of them in person, posing as a potential client who needed equipment transported to a similar location for environmental research. It was a risky strategy, but Eleanor hoped that someone might remember an unusual job from 12 years ago. Her first 2 stops yielded nothing useful. The companies had detailed records of their recent operations, but their archives from 2013 were either incomplete or had been stored in ways that made them difficult to search. Eleanor was beginning to think this approach was a dead end when she arrived at the 3rd company, a family-owned operation called Hernandez Heavy Transport that had been moving equipment throughout South Florida for over 30 years. The owner, Carlos Hernandez, was a man in his 60s who still personally oversaw the most challenging transport jobs. When Eleanor described the kind of operation she was researching, his expression immediately became guarded. He asked several pointed questions about who she was working for and why she needed this particular type of service. Eleanor could tell that her questions had triggered some kind of memory, and she decided to take a calculated risk. Eleanor identified herself truthfully and explained that she was investigating her son's disappearance in connection with an illegal operation in the Everglades. She told Hernandez that she had evidence of equipment being transported to a remote area during the time frame when David had vanished, and that she was trying to find out who had been responsible. Hernandez listened carefully, and when Eleanor finished explaining, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, Hernandez told Eleanor that he remembered the job she was asking about, and that it had been one of the most unusual and disturbing experiences of his career. In June 2013, his company had been contracted to transport industrial equipment to a remote location in the Everglades by a client who had paid triple their normal rates and insisted on absolute secrecy. The client had provided detailed maps showing exactly how to reach the site and had arranged for guides to meet the transport crews at specific coordinates. What had made the job so memorable was the atmosphere of secrecy and urgency that surrounded it. The equipment had been delivered at night, using specialized airboats to navigate the final miles through the swamp. The client's representatives had been armed and had made it clear that the transport crews were not to ask questions or discuss the job with anyone. Hernandez had been in the transport business for decades, but he'd never encountered a client who was so paranoid about maintaining secrecy. Even more disturbing was what happened after the equipment was delivered. Hernandez's company had been contracted to retrieve the equipment in late July, but when his crews arrived at the pickup location, they found the site completely abandoned. The equipment was gone, the temporary structures had been dismantled, and the area showed signs of hasty cleanup. The client had paid the retrieval fee in advance, but they never contacted Hernandez to explain what had happened or where the equipment had been taken. Eleanor asked Hernandez if he still had records from the job, and he told her that he'd kept detailed documentation because the whole experience had made him nervous about potential legal liability. He disappeared into his office and returned with a thick folder containing transport manifests, payment records, and photographs of the equipment being loaded onto the specialized airboats. As Eleanor looked through the documents, she felt her heart racing with excitement and dread. The equipment list matched exactly what she'd seen in the Teradyne documents: industrial pumps, extraction machinery, prefabricated buildings, and generators had all been transported to the exact coordinates where Eleanor had spotted the rectangular anomaly in the satellite imagery. The timeline was perfect. Equipment delivered on June 14th, just one day before David's disappearance, and the site abandoned in late July, around the time the official search for David had been scaled back. But most shocking of all were the photographs Hernandez had taken of the transport operation. The images showed massive pieces of mining equipment being loaded onto airboats under the cover of darkness, equipment that was clearly designed for extracting something from the Earth rather than conducting geological surveys. This wasn't scientific research or mineral exploration. This was full-scale illegal mining in one of the most protected ecosystems in the United States. Hernandez told Eleanor that he'd always wondered what his clients had been mining out there in the swamp and whether their operation had been legal. The secretive nature of the job and the sudden abandonment of the site had convinced him that something criminal had been taking place. He'd considered reporting his suspicions to the authorities, but he'd been afraid of retaliation from people who had clearly been willing to pay enormous sums to keep their activities secret. Eleanor asked Hernandez if he would be willing to share this information with the National Park Service investigation that Dr. Valdez was launching. Hernandez agreed, but only on the condition that his identity be protected and that he wouldn't be required to testify publicly unless he was given immunity from any potential charges related to unknowingly assisting in illegal activities. Eleanor assured him that she would do everything possible to protect him while ensuring that his evidence reached the right people. As Eleanor drove away from Hernandez Heavy Transport, she felt a mixture of triumph and growing dread. She now had documentary evidence and eyewitness testimony proving that a major illegal mining operation had been taking place in the exact area where David had disappeared during the exact time frame of his canoe trip. She had proof that the operation had been conducted with military-level secrecy and that it had been abandoned suddenly in the weeks following David's disappearance. The circumstantial evidence connecting David's fate to this illegal operation was becoming overwhelming. But Eleanor also realized that she was no longer investigating a simple missing person case. She was uncovering evidence of a complex criminal conspiracy that had involved multiple companies, significant financial resources, and the ability to manipulate federal search and rescue operations. The people behind this operation had already demonstrated that they were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect their secrets, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was putting herself in serious danger by continuing to dig into their activities. Eleanor decided to return to her hotel and organize all the evidence she'd gathered before deciding on her next move. She spread the documents and photographs across her bed and began creating a timeline of events that connected David's disappearance to the illegal mining operation. The pattern that emerged was both compelling and terrifying. David had set out on his canoe trip on Saturday, June 15th, planning to photograph wildlife in the remote areas of the Everglades. The illegal mining operation had begun transporting equipment to their site on Friday, June 14th, using nighttime operations and armed security to maintain secrecy. Based on his planned route and paddling speed, David would have reached the area around the mining site sometime on Sunday morning, June 16th. If David had discovered the mining operation, either by accident or because he'd been drawn to investigate unusual sounds or lights, he would have found himself witnessing major criminal activity in the heart of a national park. As an environmental science graduate and the son of a senator known for environmental protection, David would have understood immediately that what he was seeing was completely illegal. He would have wanted to document it, to gather evidence that could be used to stop the operation and prosecute those responsible. But the mining operation's security protocols had anticipated the possibility of unexpected visitors. They had developed contingency procedures for dealing with anyone who might discover their activities. And David Miller, with his camera and his determination to protect the environment, had become exactly the kind of threat that those procedures were designed to eliminate. Eleanor stared at the timeline she'd created, feeling sick as the implications became clear. Her son hadn't died in a canoeing accident. He'd been murdered to protect an illegal mining operation that was stealing resources from one of the most precious ecosystems in the world. The people responsible had used their money and influence to manipulate the search and rescue operation, ensuring that David's body would never be found and that their crimes would remain hidden. But even as Eleanor grappled with this horrifying realization, she knew that she still didn't have enough evidence to prove what had happened. She had compelling circumstantial evidence connecting David to the mining operation, but she needed more to convince authorities to pursue criminal charges against the people responsible. She needed to find out who was behind Everglades resource development, who had financed the operation, and who had given the orders that had cost her son his life. Eleanor spent the rest of the evening researching the corporate structure behind Everglades resource development, following the trail of shell companies and holding corporations that had been designed to obscure the true ownership of the operation. It was painstaking work, requiring her to cross-reference business filings from multiple states and piece together connections that had been deliberately obscured by layers of legal complexity. Finally, after hours of searching, Eleanor found what she was looking for. Buried deep in the Delaware Incorporation records for one of the holding companies was the name of the person who had ultimately financed the Everglades operation. The signature on the incorporation documents belonged to someone she recognized, someone whose involvement in her son's disappearance would shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew about the case. The name on the document was Marcus Miller, her own husband David's father, the senator who had built his career on environmental protection and family values. According to the corporate records, Senator Marcus Miller had been the secret owner of Everglades Resource Development, the company responsible for the illegal mining operation that had been taking place when David disappeared. Eleanor stared at the signature for a long time, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Her husband, the man who had grieved with her for 12 years, who had held her while she cried for their lost son, had been secretly involved in the very operation that had led to David's death. The realization hit her like a physical blow, leaving her gasping for breath and fighting the urge to vomit. But even as Eleanor reeled from this discovery, her investigative instincts were already working to understand the implications. If Marcus had been involved in the mining operation, it would explain why certain areas had been excluded from the search, why the investigation had been closed so quickly, and why no one had ever followed up on the suspicious circumstances surrounding David's disappearance. Marcus had used his political influence to cover up his own involvement in their son's death. Eleanor realized that she was no longer just investigating what had happened to David. She was uncovering evidence that her own husband was responsible for their son's murder, and that he had spent 12 years manipulating her grief to protect himself from the consequences of his crimes. The man she had trusted and leaned on during the darkest period of her life had been the architect of that darkness all along. Eleanor sat on the edge of her hotel bed, staring at Marcus's signature on the corporate documents until the letters began to blur together. Her hands were shaking so violently that she had to put the papers down before she tore them. 12 years of marriage before David's disappearance, 12 years of shared grief afterward, and all that time, Marcus had known exactly what had happened to their son. He had known because he had caused it. The memories came flooding back, each one now tainted with the knowledge of Marcus's deception. She remembered how calm he had seemed during those first desperate days of searching, how he had urged patience when she wanted to expand the search area, how he had seemed almost relieved when the official investigation was scaled back. She had interpreted his behavior as grief and shock, but now she understood it had been the careful performance of a man protecting himself from discovery. Eleanor forced herself to think like the investigative journalist she had once been, to push past the emotional devastation and focus on what this revelation meant for understanding David's fate. If Marcus had been behind the mining operation, he would have known exactly when and where David had disappeared. He would have known who was responsible and what had been done to cover it up. Most importantly, he would know where David's body had been hidden for the past 12 years. The thought of confronting Marcus directly made Eleanor's stomach clench with fear and revulsion. The man she had shared a bed with for over 2 decades, the man who had comforted her through countless nights of grief, was responsible for murdering their own son. But Eleanor also knew that a direct confrontation would give Marcus the opportunity to destroy evidence or silence anyone who might be willing to testify against him. She needed to be smarter than that. Eleanor spent the rest of the night going through the corporate documents again, this time looking for any other names or connections that might lead her to people who had worked directly with Marcus on the mining operation. She found references to several consulting firms and equipment suppliers, but most interesting was a series of payments to a company called Blackwater Security Solutions, which appeared to have provided site protection services for the Everglades operation. Eleanor had heard of Blackwater Security Solutions before, during her journalism career. They were a private military contractor that specialized in providing security for controversial operations in remote locations. If Marcus had hired Blackwater to protect his mining operation, it meant the site had been guarded by professional soldiers who would have been trained to deal with any threats to the operation's secrecy. David wouldn't have stood a chance against people like that. As dawn broke over Miami, Eleanor made a decision that she knew would change her life forever. She was going to expose Marcus for what he had done, regardless of the personal cost. But she also knew that accusing a sitting U.S. senator of murdering his own son would require ironclad evidence that couldn't be dismissed or discredited. She needed to find proof that directly connected Marcus to David's death, and she needed to do it without alerting him to her investigation. Eleanor's first step was to reach out to Dr. Patricia Valdez at the National Park Service to share what she had discovered about Marcus's involvement in Everglades resource development. Valdez was shocked by the revelation, but agreed that it provided crucial context for understanding why the original search and rescue operation had been compromised. She promised to quietly expand her internal investigation to include a review of any contacts between Senator Miller's office and park officials during the search period. Eleanor's next call was to her old editor at the Washington Post, Jonathan Hayes, who had mentored her during her early journalism career and remained a close friend even after she left the profession. Hayes had spent 40 years investigating political corruption and understood better than anyone how to build a case against powerful people who thought they were above the law. When Eleanor explained what she had discovered, Hayes was quiet for a long time before speaking. Hayes told Eleanor that her story was potentially the biggest political scandal in decades, but that it was also incredibly dangerous. Accusing a senator of murder, especially when that senator was the victim's own father, would trigger a massive media firestorm and legal battle. Eleanor would need absolutely bulletproof evidence to survive the scrutiny that would follow, and she would need allies who could help protect her from retaliation. Hayes offered to quietly begin his own investigation from Washington, using his contacts and resources to verify Eleanor's findings and gather additional evidence. While Hayes worked his sources in the capital, Eleanor decided to focus on finding someone who had been directly involved in the Everglades operation and might be willing to provide testimony about what had really happened to David. The Blackwater Security Solutions connection seemed like the most promising lead, since private military contractors often kept detailed records of their operations and employed people who might be willing to talk if approached correctly. Eleanor's research into Blackwater revealed that the company had been dissolved in 2018, following a series of legal troubles and congressional investigations. But many of its former employees had moved to other private security firms, and Eleanor was able to track down several names of people who might have worked on the Everglades operation. Most of these leads proved to be dead ends, but Eleanor finally found a promising contact through a veterans support group online. The contact was a former Blackwater operative named Tommy Rodriguez, who had posted in the support group about struggling with PTSD related to his work in remote security operations. Eleanor sent Rodriguez a carefully worded private message, explaining that she was researching security operations in the Everglades during 2013 and offering to pay for information about Blackwater's activities in that area. Rodriguez responded within hours, agreeing to meet with Eleanor but insisting that they meet somewhere far from Miami where they wouldn't be observed. Eleanor drove north to a small diner outside Gainesville, where Rodriguez had agreed to meet her. He was a compact man in his early 40s, with the kind of wary alertness that comes from years of dangerous work. Rodriguez ordered coffee but didn't touch it, instead focusing intently on Eleanor as she explained what she was investigating. When Eleanor mentioned her son's disappearance in the Everglades, Rodriguez's expression changed completely. Rodriguez told Eleanor that he remembered the Everglades operation very well, because it had been one of the most disturbing assignments of his career. Blackwater had been hired to provide security for what they were told was a sensitive geological survey operation, but it had quickly become clear that the real purpose was illegal mining. Rodriguez and his team had been instructed to prevent anyone from accessing the operation site and to deal with any unexpected visitors using whatever means necessary. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists as Rodriguez described the security protocols that had been established for the mining operation. His team had been equipped with surveillance equipment to monitor the waterways around the site, and they had been authorized to use lethal force if anyone attempted to document or interfere with the operation. Rodriguez said that everyone involved understood that the operation was completely illegal and that discovery would mean prison sentences for all involved. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment before telling Eleanor about the morning of June 16, 2013. His surveillance equipment had detected a small watercraft approaching the mining site, and when they investigated, they found a young man in a canoe taking photographs of the operation. The man had identified himself as David Miller and claimed that he was conducting environmental research for his university. Rodriguez's team leader had immediately contacted their client to report the situation and request instructions. Eleanor felt sick as Rodriguez described what happened next. The client, who Rodriguez now understood had been Senator Marcus Miller, had given explicit orders that David could not be allowed to leave the area with evidence of the mining operation. Rodriguez had argued against using lethal force, pointing out that David was just a college student who had stumbled across something he didn't understand, but the team leader had made it clear that their orders came from the very top of the political hierarchy and were not subject to debate. Rodriguez told Eleanor that he had refused to participate in what happened to David, and that he had been reassigned to other duties immediately afterward. He never saw David again, but he knew from conversations with other team members that the young man had been killed and his body disposed of in a way that would ensure it was never found. The canoe had been moved to a different location to make it appear that David had suffered an accident, and his belongings had been scattered to support that narrative. Eleanor struggled to maintain her composure as Rodriguez described her son's final moments. David had been excited about his photographs, convinced that he had discovered evidence of illegal activity that needed to be reported to the authorities. He had no idea that the people he was talking to had already been ordered to kill him, and that his own father had given those orders. David had died believing he was doing the right thing, trying to protect the environment he loved, never knowing that his murder had been orchestrated by the man who should have protected him most. Rodriguez told Eleanor that his refusal to participate in David's murder had effectively ended his career with Blackwater. He had been blacklisted from other private security firms and had struggled with PTSD and guilt over his inability to save David. He had always hoped that someday he would have the opportunity to tell someone what had really happened, to help David's family find closure and hold the people responsible accountable for their crimes. Eleanor asked Rodriguez if he would be willing to provide official testimony about David's murder, and he agreed immediately. He said he had kept detailed records of the Everglades operation, including communications with the client and documentation of the security protocols that had been established. He also had the names and contact information for other Blackwater operatives who had been involved, some of whom might also be willing to testify if they were offered immunity from prosecution. As Eleanor drove back to Miami, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. She finally knew exactly what had happened to David, and she had a witness who could provide testimony that would expose Marcus and the others responsible for his murder. But she also had to grapple with the reality that her own husband had ordered their son's execution to protect his illegal business interests. The man she had loved and trusted for over 20 years was a cold-blooded killer who had manipulated her grief for more than a decade. Eleanor knew that she now had enough evidence to destroy Marcus's career and potentially send him to prison for the rest of his life. But she also knew that exposing the truth would shatter her own life in the process. She would become the center of a massive media circus, the woman who exposed her own husband's crimes and brought down one of the most prominent environmental senators in the country. Her marriage, her privacy, and her quiet life would all be sacrificed on the altar of justice for David. But as Eleanor thought about David's final moments, about his excitement over discovering the illegal mining operation and his determination to report it to the authorities, she knew she had no choice. David had died trying to protect the environment, and the least she could do was ensure that his killers faced justice for their crimes. Marcus had stolen 12 years of her life through his lies and manipulation, but he wouldn't steal another day. Eleanor called Jonathan Hayes to update him on what she had learned from Rodriguez, and Hayes confirmed that his own investigation in Washington had uncovered additional evidence linking Marcus to the Everglades operation. Hayes had found records of meetings between Marcus's staff and officials from the Interior Department around the time of David's disappearance, meetings that had apparently been arranged to ensure that any investigation into illegal activities in the Everglades would be handled discreetly. Hayes had also discovered that Marcus had received significant campaign contributions from mining and extraction companies in the months leading up to the Everglades operation, contributions that had been funneled through a complex network of political action committees to obscure their source. The timing and amounts of these contributions suggested that Marcus had been paid to facilitate illegal mining access to protected federal lands, using his position on the Senate Environment Committee to provide political cover for the operation. Eleanor and Hayes agreed that they now had sufficient evidence to publish a story that would expose Marcus's crimes and trigger a criminal investigation. But they also agreed that Eleanor needed to be extremely careful about how she proceeded, because Marcus would undoubtedly use all of his political influence and resources to discredit her and suppress the evidence. They would need to coordinate the release of information carefully to maximize its impact and minimize the opportunities for cover-up or retaliation. Eleanor decided that her first step should be to confront Marcus directly, both to give him the opportunity to confess and to record his response for potential use as evidence. She knew it would be dangerous to meet with Marcus now that she knew what he was capable of, but she also knew that she needed closure on 24 years of marriage before she could move forward with destroying his life. Eleanor flew back to Washington that evening and went directly to the family home in Georgetown, the house where she and Marcus had raised David and where they had grieved together for his loss. The house felt different now, tainted by the knowledge of Marcus's deception, and Eleanor found herself looking at familiar objects and wondering what other lies might be hidden beneath the surface of their life together. Marcus was in his study when Eleanor arrived, reviewing briefing materials for upcoming committee hearings. He looked up with surprise when Eleanor entered the room, clearly not expecting her to return from Miami so soon. Eleanor studied his face carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or fear, but Marcus appeared calm and composed, the same expression he wore when dealing with difficult political situations. Eleanor sat down across from Marcus's desk and told him that she had something important to discuss about David's disappearance. She watched Marcus's face carefully as she explained that she had discovered new evidence about what had happened in the Everglades, evidence that suggested David's death had not been an accident. Marcus listened without interrupting, but Eleanor could see tension building in his jaw and around his eyes. When Eleanor finished her explanation, Marcus was quiet for a long moment, before asking what kind of evidence she had found. Eleanor could hear the calculation in his voice, the same tone he used when assessing political threats and developing strategies to neutralize them. She realized that Marcus was already working to figure out how much she knew and how he could discredit or suppress whatever evidence she had gathered. Eleanor decided to take a direct approach. She told Marcus that she knew about Everglades resource development, about the illegal mining operation, and about his role in ordering David's murder. She told him that she had witnesses who were willing to testify about what had happened and evidence that would prove his guilt beyond any doubt. She gave him the opportunity to confess and explain why he had been willing to kill their own son to protect his business interests. Marcus's mask finally slipped, and Eleanor saw something cold and calculating in his eyes that she had never noticed before. He told Eleanor that she was making a serious mistake by investigating things she didn't understand, and that there were aspects of the situation that were far more complex than she realized. He warned her that pursuing this investigation would destroy not only his career but her own life as well, and that the people involved in the Everglades operation would not hesitate to protect themselves from exposure. Eleanor realized that Marcus was threatening her, just as he had threatened David all those years ago. The man she had once loved was warning her that she could end up like their son if she continued to pursue the truth. But instead of fear, Eleanor felt a cold fury that gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She told Marcus that she was going to expose everything he had done, regardless of the consequences, and that justice for David was worth any personal cost she might have to pay. As Eleanor stood to leave Marcus's study, he made one final attempt to stop her. He told her that David's death had been an accident, a tragic result of security protocols that had gotten out of hand, and that he had covered it up only to protect the family from scandal. He claimed that he had been trying to develop legal mining operations that would fund environmental conservation efforts, and that David had stumbled into the middle of a complex situation that he couldn't possibly have understood. Eleanor looked at her husband with complete disgust and told him that she knew he was lying, just as he had been lying for the past 12 years. She told him that she would never forgive him for what he had done to David and what he had done to her by forcing her to grieve for a son whose murder he had orchestrated. As she walked out of the house they had shared for so many years, Eleanor knew she would never return. Eleanor drove directly to Jonathan Hayes's office at the Washington Post, where they spent the rest of the night preparing the story that would expose Marcus Miller's crimes to the world. Hayes had assembled a team of investigative reporters who had been quietly gathering additional evidence, and together they crafted an article that would detail every aspect of the conspiracy, from the illegal mining operation to David's murder to the cover-up that had followed. As dawn broke over Washington, Eleanor realized that she had reached the point of no return. In a few hours the story would be published, and the world would learn that Senator Marcus Miller had ordered the murder of his own son to protect an illegal business operation. Eleanor's life as she had known it would be over, but for the first time in 12 years, she felt like she was finally honoring David's memory in the way he would have wanted. The Washington Post published Eleanor's story at exactly 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning with the headline, "Senator Ordered Son's Murder to Cover Illegal Mining Operation, Investigation Reveals." Within minutes, every major news network in the country was scrambling to catch up on what would become the biggest political scandal in a generation. Eleanor watched the story break from Jonathan Hayes's office, feeling a mixture of vindication and terror as she realized there was no going back from what she had set in motion. The initial media reaction was explosive, but cautious. Most outlets began by reporting that allegations had been made against Senator Miller, carefully avoiding definitive statements about his guilt while they worked to verify the evidence independently. But Hayes had done his work well, providing documentation and witness statements that were impossible to dismiss as speculation or political attack. By noon, major networks were confirming key elements of the story and calling for immediate congressional investigations. Marcus's response was swift and predictable. Within hours of the story's publication, his office released a statement categorically denying all allegations and claiming that Eleanor was suffering from a psychological breakdown related to unresolved grief over their son's death. Marcus portrayed himself as a grieving father who was being victimized by false accusations, and he suggested that Eleanor's claims were the product of conspiracy theories and desperation rather than factual evidence. But Marcus's denials became increasingly difficult to maintain as more evidence emerged throughout the day. Dr. Patricia Valdez held a press conference in which she confirmed that the National Park Service was investigating irregularities in the original search and rescue operation for David Miller, including evidence that false information had been provided to exclude certain areas from the search. Tommy Rodriguez came forward publicly to confirm his testimony about David's murder, providing detailed accounts that matched perfectly with the documentary evidence Eleanor had gathered. By evening, the story had moved beyond the realm of political scandal and into criminal territory. The FBI announced that they were opening a formal investigation into David Miller's death and the illegal mining operation in the Everglades. The Senate Ethics Committee called for an immediate suspension of Marcus's committee assignments pending a full investigation. Several of Marcus's longtime allies in the Senate began distancing themselves from him, issuing statements expressing shock and concern about the allegations. Eleanor found herself at the center of a media firestorm unlike anything she had experienced during her journalism career. News crews camped outside her hotel, reporters called constantly seeking interviews, and social media exploded with commentary about the case. Some people praised her courage in exposing the truth, while others accused her of destroying her own family for attention and political gain. Eleanor struggled to maintain her composure as she was forced to relive David's death in excruciating detail for investigators and reporters. The FBI investigation moved quickly, aided by the extensive evidence that Eleanor and Hayes had already gathered. Federal agents seized records from Marcus's office and homes, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and began tracing the financial connections between Marcus and the various companies involved in the Everglades operation. Within a week, they had confirmed the basic elements of Eleanor's account and begun building a criminal case against Marcus and his co-conspirators. Carlos Hernandez, the transport company owner, provided detailed testimony about the equipment that had been moved to the mining site and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the operation's sudden abandonment. Maria Santos, the former Teradyne employee, came forward with additional documents that proved the environmental assessments had been falsified to provide regulatory cover for illegal activities. Other former employees of companies involved in the operation began contacting the FBI with information about their roles in the conspiracy. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that the Everglades operation had been part of a much larger pattern of corruption involving Marcus and his associates. Federal investigators discovered that Marcus had accepted millions of dollars in bribes from mining and extraction companies over a period of several years, using his position on the Senate Environment Committee to facilitate illegal access to protected federal lands. The Everglades operation had been just one of several illegal mining projects that Marcus had helped establish throughout the country. Marcus's political career collapsed with stunning speed. Within 2 weeks of the story's publication, he had been expelled from the Senate Environment Committee and stripped of his leadership positions. His longtime chief of staff resigned and began cooperating with federal investigators. Major donors and political allies abandoned him as evidence of his crimes became overwhelming. Opinion polls showed that over 80% of his constituents believed he should resign immediately. Eleanor testified before a federal grand jury for over 6 hours, providing detailed accounts of her investigation and the evidence she had uncovered. The experience was emotionally devastating, forcing her to confront not only David's murder, but also the complete betrayal of trust that Marcus's deception represented. Eleanor found herself grieving not only for her son, but also for the marriage and life that had been built on lies. The grand jury returned indictments against Marcus and 12 other defendants on charges including murder, conspiracy, bribery, environmental crimes, and obstruction of justice. Marcus was arrested at his Senate office in a scene that was broadcast live on every major news network. Eleanor watched the arrest from her hotel room, feeling no satisfaction at seeing her husband led away in handcuffs. The man being arrested was a stranger to her now, someone whose true nature she had never really known. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and highly publicized. Marcus's lawyers attempted to portray him as a victim of overzealous prosecution and claimed that he had no direct knowledge of David's murder, arguing that rogue security contractors had exceeded their authority in dealing with an unexpected situation. But the documentary evidence and witness testimony were overwhelming, particularly Tommy Rodriguez's detailed account of receiving direct orders from Marcus to eliminate David as a threat to the operation. Eleanor was subpoenaed to testify at Marcus's trial, an experience that required her to confront him directly for the first time since their confrontation in his study. Marcus had aged significantly during the months of investigation and pre-trial proceedings, and Eleanor could see the weight of his crimes in his haggard appearance. When she took the witness stand and looked at him across the courtroom, she felt nothing but cold hatred for what he had done to their family. Eleanor's testimony was devastating to Marcus's defense. She methodically detailed the evidence she had uncovered, the lies Marcus had told during their marriage, and the manipulation he had used to exploit her grief for David. When Marcus's lawyer attempted to suggest that Eleanor was motivated by revenge rather than justice, she responded with a quiet dignity that impressed everyone in the courtroom. Eleanor made it clear that she was testifying not out of hatred for Marcus, but out of love for David, and a determination to ensure that his killers faced justice. The trial lasted for 3 months and became a daily obsession for news networks and social media. Eleanor attended every day of proceedings, sitting in the gallery and watching as witness after witness described Marcus's crimes in detail. She heard Tommy Rodriguez describe David's final moments, listened to Carlos Hernandez explain how equipment had been transported to facilitate illegal mining, and watched as former associates of Marcus testified about the bribes and corruption that had made the operation possible. The most difficult moment came when the prosecution played recordings of Marcus's phone calls with the Blackwater security team leader on the morning of David's death. Eleanor heard her husband's voice giving explicit orders for David to be killed, describing their own son as a security threat that needed to be permanently neutralized. The clinical coldness in Marcus's voice as he ordered their child's murder was more devastating than any physical blow Eleanor had ever experienced. When the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges, Eleanor felt a complex mixture of relief and emptiness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring David back or erase the years of grief and deception she had endured. Marcus was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that seemed both appropriate and inadequate for the magnitude of his crimes. Several of his co-conspirators received lengthy prison sentences, and the companies involved in the operation faced massive financial penalties. Eleanor found herself struggling to rebuild her life in the aftermath of the trial. The media attention gradually subsided, but she remained a public figure associated with one of the most shocking political scandals in American history. She couldn't return to her old life in Georgetown, where every location held memories of her marriage to Marcus and the family they had built together. She couldn't resume her environmental activism work without being constantly reminded of the irony that her husband had been destroying the very ecosystems she was trying to protect. Dr. Patricia Valdez contacted Eleanor several months after the trial to provide an update on the National Park Service's efforts to remediate the environmental damage caused by the illegal mining operation. The Park Service had located the exact site of the operation using Eleanor's satellite imagery and had begun the process of restoring the damaged ecosystem. Valdez told Eleanor that the site would eventually be designated as a memorial to David and other environmental activists who had died protecting the natural world. Eleanor also received an unexpected letter from Tommy Rodriguez, the former Blackwater operative, whose testimony had been crucial to convicting Marcus. Rodriguez wrote that testifying in the trial had helped him find peace with his own role in the events, and that he hoped Eleanor could also find some measure of healing now that David's killers had been brought to justice. Rodriguez mentioned that he had established a foundation to support families of environmental activists who had been killed or threatened for their work, and he invited Eleanor to serve on the board. As Eleanor considered Rodriguez's offer, she realized that she had reached a turning point in her own healing process. For 12 years, she had been defined by her status as the grieving mother of a missing child, living in limbo between hope and despair. The trial had given her definitive answers about David's fate, but it had also forced her to confront the complete destruction of her former life. Now she needed to decide who she wanted to be, in whatever time remained to her. Eleanor decided to accept Rodriguez's invitation and throw herself into supporting other families who had lost loved ones to environmental crimes. She used her experience as an investigative journalist to help expose other illegal operations that threatened protected ecosystems, working with law enforcement agencies and environmental groups to prevent other families from experiencing the loss she had endured. The work was meaningful and helped her feel connected to David's passion for environmental protection. But even as Eleanor built a new life dedicated to environmental justice, she couldn't escape the fundamental question that haunted her. Where was David's body? The trial had provided extensive evidence about how David had been killed and why, but it had not revealed where his remains had been hidden. Tommy Rodriguez and the other Blackwater operatives claimed they had been excluded from the body disposal operation, which had been handled by other members of the conspiracy who were still refusing to cooperate with authorities. Eleanor knew that she would never have complete peace until David could be properly buried, until she could visit a grave and say goodbye to her son in the way that parents should be able to do. The knowledge that David's body was still somewhere in the Everglades, hidden by people who had seen him only as a problem to be eliminated, continued to torment her. She had exposed Marcus's crimes and seen him punished for them, but David remained lost in the same swamp where he had died 13 years earlier. Federal investigators continued to search for David's remains, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs to examine areas identified through witness testimony and satellite analysis. But the Everglades covered thousands of square miles of difficult terrain, and 13 years of exposure to the elements and wildlife had likely eliminated most traces of David's body. Each failed search expedition reminded Eleanor that even complete justice for Marcus's crimes might not be enough to bring her the closure she desperately needed. Eleanor began to accept that she might never find David's body, that her son might remain forever lost in the wilderness he had loved so much. It was a devastating realization, but it also freed her to focus on honoring David's memory through her work, rather than continuing to search for his physical remains. She established a scholarship fund for environmental science students and worked with universities to develop research programs focused on protecting vulnerable ecosystems from illegal exploitation. As the second anniversary of Marcus's conviction approached, Eleanor received a phone call that would change everything once again. The caller identified himself as Dr. Michael Chen, the satellite imagery specialist who had helped her analyze the original photographs of the Everglades anomaly. Chen told Eleanor that he had been continuing to study satellite images of the area where David had disappeared, using new techniques and higher resolution data that had recently become available. Chen had discovered something that had been invisible in the earlier imagery, something that might finally lead Eleanor to the answers she had been seeking for over a decade. The discovery was so significant that Chen insisted on meeting with Eleanor in person to share what he had found, warning her that the information would be both shocking and potentially dangerous. As Eleanor agreed to meet with Chen, she felt the familiar mixture of hope and dread that had defined her investigation from the beginning. Eleanor knew that whatever Chen had discovered would likely be the final piece of the puzzle surrounding David's death. After years of searching for the truth and fighting for justice, she was about to learn the last secret that had been hidden in the Everglades for 13 years. She had no idea that Chen's discovery would not only reveal where David had been buried, but would also expose one final betrayal that would shake her understanding of everything she thought she knew about her son's death. Eleanor met Dr. Chen at a small coffee shop near the University of Miami, the same place where they had first discussed the satellite anomaly that had launched her investigation over 2 years earlier. Chen looked exhausted and nervous, constantly glancing around the coffee shop as if he expected to be overheard. When Eleanor asked him what he had discovered, Chen pulled out a tablet computer and warned her that what she was about to see would be disturbing. The satellite images on Chen's tablet were taken with advanced thermal imaging technology that had only recently become available to civilian researchers. The images showed the same area of the Everglades where the illegal mining operation had taken place, but the thermal data revealed something that had been completely invisible in previous photographs. Approximately half a mile from the mining site, hidden beneath the water and vegetation, was a large rectangular area that showed a completely different thermal signature from the surrounding environment. Chen explained that the thermal anomaly suggested a significant disturbance in the natural soil and water composition, the kind of disturbance that would be created by burying large amounts of organic material in an area that had previously been undisturbed wetland. The rectangular shape and precise boundaries of the anomaly indicated that whatever had been buried there had been done systematically and deliberately, not as a result of natural processes or random dumping. Eleanor stared at the thermal images, her heart pounding as she realized what Chen was showing her. Someone had created a burial site in the Everglades, large enough and organized enough to suggest that multiple bodies had been interred there. The location was far enough from the mining operation to avoid detection during any investigation of that site, but close enough to have been accessible to the people responsible for David's murder. Chen told Eleanor that he had spent months analyzing the thermal data and consulting with forensic experts to understand what could create this type of signature. The consensus was that the site contained significant amounts of decomposed organic material that had been buried in a way that prevented normal decomposition processes. The experts believed that multiple bodies had been buried there, possibly over a period of several years, and that the site had been designed to prevent discovery through normal investigative techniques. Eleanor asked Chen if he had shared this information with federal investigators, and he told her that he had been afraid to contact the FBI directly. Chen had been following the news coverage of Marcus's trial and had become convinced that the conspiracy involved people with enough power and resources to silence anyone who threatened their interests. He had decided to share his discovery with Eleanor first, trusting that she would know how to proceed safely. Eleanor immediately contacted the FBI task force that had been responsible for investigating David's murder. The lead investigator, Special Agent Sarah Martinez, had worked closely with Eleanor throughout Marcus's prosecution and had become personally invested in finding David's remains. When Eleanor described Chen's discovery, Martinez agreed to meet with them immediately to review the thermal imagery and discuss the implications. Agent Martinez brought a team of forensic experts and search specialists to examine Chen's data, and their analysis confirmed his conclusions. The thermal anomaly represented a significant burial site that had been created through deliberate human activity, not natural processes. The site appeared to contain multiple bodies that had been buried at different times over a period of several years, suggesting that David might not have been the only victim of the conspiracy. Martinez explained that accessing the burial site would be extremely challenging due to its location in the heart of the Everglades. The site was underwater for much of the year and surrounded by dangerous wildlife and unstable terrain. Any recovery operation would require specialized equipment and extensive planning to ensure the safety of the forensic team and preserve any evidence that might remain after 13 years of exposure to the elements. Eleanor begged Martinez to authorize an immediate recovery mission, but the agent explained that the logistics would take several weeks to organize. The FBI would need to coordinate with the National Park Service, bring in specialized diving and excavation equipment, and establish a secure base of operations in the remote area. Martinez promised Eleanor that the recovery mission would be given the highest priority, but she warned that the process would be slow and difficult. Eleanor couldn't bear the thought of waiting several more weeks to learn David's fate after coming so close to finding him. She asked Martinez if she could be present during the recovery operation, and the agent initially refused, explaining that the site would be dangerous and that civilian observers could interfere with the forensic work. But Eleanor's persistence and her role in uncovering the truth about David's murder eventually convinced Martinez to allow her to observe from a safe distance. The recovery operation began on a clear morning in early March, with Eleanor watching from a command boat positioned several hundred yards from the burial site. The forensic team used specialized equipment to drain the water from the burial area and began the painstaking process of excavating the site layer by layer. Eleanor could see the team working through binoculars, but she couldn't make out any details of what they were finding. The first body was discovered on the second day of excavation, and Agent Martinez radioed Eleanor to inform her that the remains appeared to be those of a young adult male who had been buried approximately 13 years earlier. The body was found with personal items that included a damaged camera and a Georgetown University class ring, items that Eleanor immediately recognized as belonging to David. Eleanor felt her knees buckle as Martinez confirmed that they had found David's remains. After 13 years of searching and wondering, her son had finally been located. But even as Eleanor experienced the relief of finally knowing where David was, she was horrified by the realization that he had been buried in this remote location with other victims of the conspiracy, treated like waste to be disposed of, rather than a human being deserving of dignity and proper burial. As the excavation continued over the following days, the forensic team uncovered the remains of 6 other individuals who had been buried at the site over a period of several years. The victims ranged in age from their early 20s to their 50s, and all appeared to have been people who had somehow threatened the conspiracy's operations. Some had been environmental activists, others had been journalists or researchers, and at least one appeared to have been a park ranger who had gotten too close to discovering the illegal activities. Eleanor was devastated to learn that David had not been the only victim of Marcus's crimes, that her son had been part of a pattern of murders designed to protect the conspiracy's illegal operations. The discovery of multiple victims also explained why the burial site had been so carefully planned and concealed. This wasn't a hasty cover-up of a single unfortunate incident. It was a systematic operation designed to eliminate anyone who threatened the conspiracy's activities. Agent Martinez shared the preliminary forensic findings with Eleanor as the excavation progressed. David's remains showed evidence of trauma consistent with what Tommy Rodriguez had described in his testimony about the murder. The damage to David's camera suggested that he had indeed been taking photographs when he was killed, and the forensic team was working to recover any images that might still be stored on the device's memory card. Eleanor asked Martinez if the other victims had been connected to environmental crimes or threats to illegal operations, and the agent confirmed that initial investigations suggested a pattern. Several of the victims had been working on research or activism related to illegal activities in protected federal lands. Others had been journalists investigating corruption or environmental crimes. The burial site appeared to have been used as a disposal location for anyone who had become inconvenient to the conspiracy's operations. As the forensic team completed their work at the burial site, Eleanor began planning David's funeral and burial in a location where she could visit and grieve properly. But she also knew that the discovery of multiple victims meant that the investigation into Marcus's conspiracy was far from over. Federal prosecutors would need to determine if additional charges should be filed, and families of the other victims would need to be notified and provided with answers about their own losses. Eleanor found herself serving as an unofficial spokesperson for the families of the other victims, sharing her experience with the investigation and prosecution process. Many of these families had been searching for answers for years, just as she had, and they looked to her for guidance about how to navigate the legal system and media attention. Eleanor realized that her ordeal had given her unique insight into the process of seeking justice for environmental crimes and official corruption. The recovery of David's camera memory card provided the final piece of evidence needed to understand exactly what had happened during his final hours. The FBI's digital forensics team was able to recover dozens of photographs that David had taken of the illegal mining operation, images that clearly showed heavy equipment extracting materials from the protected wetlands. The photographs also captured several individuals who could be identified as members of the security team, providing additional evidence for potential prosecutions. Most importantly, the photographs proved that David had understood exactly what he was witnessing. His final images showed him methodically documenting the illegal operation from multiple angles, clearly intending to use the photographs as evidence to report the crimes to authorities. David had died doing exactly what Eleanor would have expected of him, trying to protect the environment and expose those who were destroying it for profit. Eleanor arranged for David to be buried in a small cemetery in Virginia, near the Environmental Research Center, where he had planned to begin graduate studies before his death. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including many environmental activists and researchers who saw David as a martyr for their cause. Eleanor spoke at the service about David's passion for protecting the natural world and his determination to speak truth to power, even when doing so cost him his life. Marcus did not attend David's funeral. He remained in federal prison, where he was serving multiple life sentences for his crimes. Eleanor had not spoken to Marcus since his conviction, and she had no desire to see him again. The man she had once loved and married was dead to her, replaced by the cold-blooded killer who had ordered their son's murder to protect his illegal business interests. In the months following David's burial, Eleanor threw herself into environmental activism with renewed purpose. She established the David Miller Foundation for Environmental Justice, which provided support for researchers and activists working to expose illegal activities in protected areas. The foundation also offered legal assistance to families of environmental crime victims and worked to improve protection for whistleblowers and activists. Eleanor's work with the foundation brought her into contact with investigators and activists from around the world who were fighting similar battles against corruption and environmental destruction. She learned that David's murder had been part of a much larger pattern of violence against environmental defenders, and that her success in exposing Marcus's crimes had inspired other families to demand justice for their own losses. 3 years after David's burial, Eleanor received a letter from Tommy Rodriguez informing her that he had finally found peace with his role in the events that had led to David's death. Rodriguez had become an advocate for veterans struggling with PTSD related to their service in private military companies, and he credited his testimony in Marcus's trial with helping him begin his own healing process. Rodriguez thanked Eleanor for her courage in pursuing the truth and told her that David's story had inspired him to dedicate his life to preventing other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Eleanor also maintained contact with Dr. Patricia Valdez at the National Park Service, who provided regular updates on the restoration of the damaged areas of the Everglades. Valdez told Eleanor that the site where David had been murdered had been transformed into a memorial garden for environmental crime victims, and that the restored ecosystem was thriving. The memorial included a plaque honoring David and the other victims found at the burial site, recognizing their sacrifice in defense of the natural world. As Eleanor approached the 5th anniversary of exposing Marcus's crimes, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning when she first spotted the satellite anomaly in the Everglades. She had lost everything she thought she knew about her life and family, but she had gained something more valuable, the knowledge that David's death had meaning and that his killers had faced justice. Eleanor knew that she would never fully recover from the trauma of learning that her own husband had ordered their son's murder. The betrayal was too profound and the loss too devastating for complete healing, but she had found purpose in ensuring that David's story served as a warning about the dangers faced by environmental defenders and the importance of holding powerful people accountable for their crimes. Eleanor continued to live quietly in Virginia, working with the foundation and maintaining the memorial garden she had planted in David's honor behind her house. She rarely gave interviews anymore, preferring to let her work speak for itself. But on significant anniversaries, she would share David's story with new audiences, ensuring that his sacrifice would not be forgotten and that his commitment to environmental protection would inspire future generations. On warm summer evenings, Eleanor would sit in David's memorial garden and think about the young man who had died trying to protect the wilderness he loved. She would remember his excitement about his environmental science studies, his passion for photography, and his determination to make the world a better place. Eleanor had learned that David's final photographs showed him smiling even as he documented the illegal mining operation, apparently thrilled by the opportunity to expose environmental crimes. Eleanor found comfort in knowing that David had died as he had lived, pursuing truth and justice without regard for his own safety. Her son had been exactly the person she had raised him to be, someone who would risk everything to protect the natural world and hold powerful people accountable for their actions. The fact that his own father had been responsible for his death was a tragedy beyond comprehension, but it didn't diminish the value of David's sacrifice or the importance of his example. Eleanor Miller had begun her investigation as a grieving mother, desperate for answers about her son's disappearance. She had ended it as an environmental justice advocate whose work had exposed one of the most shocking political conspiracies in American history. The personal cost had been enormous, but Eleanor knew that David would have approved of the choices she had made. Her son had died trying to protect the Everglades, and she had spent the rest of her life ensuring that his death would serve as a catalyst for protecting other vulnerable ecosystems and the people who defended them. As Eleanor watched the sun set behind the mountains from David's memorial garden, she felt at peace for the first time since that terrible day in 2013 when her son had failed to return from his canoe trip. David was finally home. Marcus was in prison where he belonged, and the truth had been told. It was enough. It had to be enough. And somewhere in the restored wetlands of the Everglades, the ecosystem that David had died protecting continued to thrive, a living monument to a young man's courage and his mother's determination to seek justice against impossible odds.